Well, hi, ladies and gentlemen. Dr. Joel Hunter here with Philosophy 135, Introduction to Ethics, Truckee Meadows Community College. This week, we're going to talk about your set of readings in the ethical life on abortion. And there is a defense of abortion, and then there is an argument for why abortion is immoral. So it's looking at the moral status of abortion. That is the topic. And I couldn't think of, I didn't plan this, but interesting that the days, or not the days, but the events of the last week or two, with the public comments from at least two of the presidential candidates, directly relate to this subject and how we think about the morality of the practice of abortion. And so I think it's going to turn out to be a very timely set of readings for you. And I think you'll find it helpful when you get into conversations about this topic, or like in responses to things that have been said by the presidential candidates. So it's been a couple weeks since I've seen you. I actually had the flu all last week. I'm probably going to cough my head off in this. That's one of those lingering cough things, but I'll do my best to get through it. So today, what I want to do with you, obviously, is go over that material. I want to prepare you for the quiz on the subject of abortion on your readings, and I want to talk about your essay question on that quiz. I want to go over that, and I also want to talk about the final subject, or the final assignment for the class. This is the analytical essay that I've had on your list of assignments, but haven't yet put up some instructions for it. What I want to do today in this video is actually go over the requirements for that assignment. And it's just an outline form, so there's not a whole lot of explanation there. There's enough for you to get started and to think about it. But I want to go over what that assignment is going to require of you, and before I put up the formal instructions of it on Canvas. And then in the showcase today, let me go ahead and see if I can manage to pull that up. Yes. No, that's the cameraman. Stand by. Showcase. Here we go. Okay, so in the showcase, I've got links to 3 websites, and one of them is an essay that came out actually today by Camille Paglia on the topic of abortion, and she has a different kind of perspective than many feminists, but I think it's one that will make a lot of sense if you've done these readings. And it would be an example of the kind of online article, opinion piece that I'm looking for you to select for the final analytical essay. And just for fun, I went ahead and searched for a couple articles on the previous topics that we've looked at. So I've also got in the showcase a piece on animal welfare, and so you can look at that. And then I've got another piece on charity as a means of fighting poverty and hunger. So those are the topics we've covered so far in our applied ethics section, and I've given you some examples of the kinds of news articles, opinion pieces that I'm asking for you to go search on your own, within one of the topics that we've read, but then it would be an article that you pick that you want to analyze. Now I'm going to go into more detail about that. I've only pointed this out to point out the showcase, that it's there and has links for you to check out, just to give you examples of what I'm going through. Okay, so what I'd like to do as a way of starting then is to go ahead and pop over to our slide deck, and let me find that. Okay. Excuse me. And as with our other videos, what I'll do is at a couple stopping points, I'll pull back into the video itself and see if anyone has any questions. Okay, so week 10, here we are, folks. We're over the halfway point. So as I said, we're going to talk about the quiz 10, what's going to be on that, and then we're going to go through the 2 abortion readings briefly. And the Q&A, I mean, it's there for you, but also the thing I didn't put on the outline here is just a brief overview of the final analytical essay. Okay, so let's talk about quiz 10, and the first reading is chapter 30, A Defense of Abortion by Judith Jarvis Thomson. So one of the first points that Thomson makes is that she thinks that it is faulty to think of the development of a human being as continuous from conception. Now, conception is when the ovum or the egg is fertilized and a zygote begins to form. So the conception then of that new life, that it's faulty to think of the development of a human being as continuous from that conception to birth and into childhood, because that's like saying that an acorn is an oak tree. So in other words, the fully developed human being, the adult human being, to say that the development of a human being is continuous from conception to birth into childhood, it is making it sound like that fully developed human being, the oak tree, is the same thing as the acorn. Okay, so you can look at her claim there, but that's in the first part of the reading. Now here is probably the most significant point in this essay to sort of grasp her argument. And the thing that's going to be possibly a challenge is that so much of the contemporary debate on abortion focuses on the legitimacy of using terms like child and person when applied to a fetus, a human fetus. Okay, so if you look at, for example, look at the comments that Hillary Clinton gave in response to a question posed by, I think it was by Chuck Todd with MSNBC. He was doing, I don't know if it was a town hall or if it was just an interview, but he asked her, look, are there any restrictions that you think are reasonable to place on abortion? And so she was answering that question, and in the course of answering it, she used the language of person in referring to the fetus. And you will find, and if you look at the responses to her interview, you'll find people on both the pro-life side as well as the pro-abortion side. You will see them both taking her to task. On the one hand, if you adopt the language of person and you think that applies to, say, a 20-week-old fetus, then you're basically admitting that abortion is taking the life of a person, and persons has a legal definition to it that we attach rights to. There's a whole argument, for example, whether a corporation is a person, and this comes out in Citizens United and other kinds of Supreme Court decisions. So the idea there is that, if you use the language of personhood attached to a human being, you are presuming or recognizing that there are obligations that person. So she got a lot of criticism, from abortion advocates, reproductive rights advocates, for using that language. And then on the pro-life side, she got criticized, obviously, because then it's almost an admission, then, if you use the language of person, that you're willing to take the life of a person rather than protect their rights to life, for example. Anyway, that gives you an example of how loaded certain terms are within this debate, and person is certainly one of them. So anyway, this is a very relevant point that Thompson raised early on in the article, and that is she allows she grants, for the sake of her argument, she grants the opponent's claim that the fetus is a person from the moment of conception. Okay, that is a significant allowance then to the pro-life side, and she is going to base her argument for the morality of abortion, in the defense of abortion, even granting that. So this is an interesting. This is why it's potentially confusing, is because you would think that those who would defend the practice of abortion would try to avoid as much as possible the language of personhood. But Thompson does not do that. Okay, and this is, by the way, where that the showcase article that I gave as an example of one that you could use for your final analytical essay by Camille Paglia, she also recognizes the personhood of the fetus, or grants, or I should say, she grants that it could be that from the moment of conception that the human fetus is a person. Okay, and yet defends the practice of abortion. Okay, so that's what I want you to be very, very clear about. So Thompson's argument is unusual, or goes against the grain of the typical kind of public arguments that are made today. Okay, and you can see how that works out for her. Then the next point is that she puts forward the opponent's argument like this. So the typical argument goes, or pro-life argument goes like this: every person has a right to life. That's claim number one. That seems on its face unproblematic. Point number two: the fetus is a person. So the fetus has a right to life. And that, of course, is the usual point of debate. That's what was debated, for example, in Roe v. Wade, the Supreme Court decision. Claim number three: the mother has the right to decide what shall happen in and to her body. Okay, this also is an important civil rights claim. So you have there, you see they're setting up a problem between 2 and 3 as two different civil rights questions. Point number 4, a person's right to life is stronger and more stringent than the mother's right to decide what happens in and to her body. Okay, so the fourth claim is this is the one where the arguer is taking a stand as to, granting that these are both important rights, one right outweighs the other in this particular case. The right to life is stronger, more stringent than the mother's right to decide what happens in and to her body. Therefore, since the right to life of the fetus morally outweighs the right of the mother to decide what happens in and to her body, the fetus may not be killed. 6, therefore, abortion is immoral and should not be performed. Okay, so there's the argument. And now, Grant, listen carefully here. This is what Thompson's reconstruction of her opponent's argument is. Remember, she's going to be arguing in defense of abortion. So she's trying to set up as strong as possible argument that is opposed to abortion as she can. And then she's going to attack that argument. So that is a valid argument in point of form. The conclusion follows from the premises. And the premises, if they're true, they entail the conclusion. And so you've got to understand which of those premises are the ones that Jarvis Johnson is going to attack or challenge, I should say, and then reject. And the one that she is going to reject is the 4, where the claim is made that a person's right to life is stronger and more stringent than the mother's right to decide what happens in and to her body. Okay, so there is the setup for her argument. Okay, so how does she go about making this argument? She says that she argues that having a right to life does not guarantee certain other rights. For example, a right to be given the use of another person's body. It does not guarantee a right to be allowed continued use of another person's body. And so what she does is she constructs a thought experiment where an individual wakes up in a hospital room and finds herself attached to another individual who, it turns out, she finds out, is that she is sustaining the life of that individual. And she develops this illustration, with more detail to sort of put the to make it as difficult as possible to try to reject. For example, I think she makes the other individual whose life is being sustained like a famous violinist or something like that. So someone, in other words, who has contributed or will contribute to society, who's recognized as important, and those kinds of things. So the setup then, or the analogy, of course, is that the mother sustains the life of the fetus that grows in her womb in much the same way that we can conceive of that as an external connection, where you have an individual who is attached in giving and sustaining the life of another individual, say in a hospital room. And so her argument is that we can recognize that other individual's life, that they have a right to that life, but that does not guarantee, or that does not obligate the person who was connected to sustain that life, without their consent. So you can't just use any other person's body to sustain the life of another person, even if that person has a right to life. And nor can you continue to use it once that's been given, once the use has been given. Okay, that's the thrust of her argument. Okay. Thompson's essay goes on, and by developing this idea about the reasons why abortion is morally permissible, she is able to then identify the sort of boundary conditions for that. And so you can go back to her, she does this, she goes back to her analogy of being hooked up to the violinist in the hospital room to sort of tease this out. And so the abortion then would be permissible in cases like the 14-year-old who becomes pregnant as a result of being raped. But she finds it would be morally impermissible in the case of a woman in her 7th month of pregnancy, that's the 3rd trimester, who wants an abortion so that she doesn't have to change her travel plans. So that's, often the language there is convenience, right? So she does recognize that, it's not a blanket moral permissibility to abortion at all stages of development of the fetus, that there at some point that right to life does weigh as much as the right for the woman to use her own body and to care for her own body. So at some point there's a tipping point where those rights are equal, and then the right to life would outweigh it. Okay, so another interesting sort of boundary problem to this would be that of, well, in expressing the desire to become detached from that life that is dependent on you to live, how far does that extend? If you're expressing the desire for that life not to live, I mean, how far can you go with that? And so here she says, and I'll just quote this: "You're not morally required to spend 9 months in bed sustaining the life of that violinist. But to say this is by no means to say that if, when you unplug yourself, there is a miracle and he survives, you then have the right to turn around and slit his throat." Okay, So the point of that hypothetical claim is to say that um, the um, the sorry, I just lost my train of thought. Let me just check real quick. Okay. Sorry, I lost my place in my notes where I was going with that. Okay, so the idea there is that, you know, if the fetus survives the abortion somehow, and this rarely happens, but it occasionally does, what she's saying is that have the right to then take the life of that fetus that survived being, well, in this case, unplugged is from the analogy. Okay, so the mother's right to decide what happens in and to her body does not continue to outweigh the fetus's right to life if the fetus survives the abortion. I guess that's the quickest way to put it. So so this shows that then there is a very important moral difference between abortion and infanticide, for example. Okay, so that is Thompson's essay, and it's very well argued, and you can then move on to the second reading, chapter 31 by Don Marquis, called Why Abortion is Immoral. So this obviously is taking the contrary position. And in Marquis's argument, and here's the key to this, is that unlike much, again, this is going to run contrary to so much of the public discourse on the topic from the right to life side, and his argument is a secular argument. It does not depend on any religious claims. Okay, so that's one key difference here. And of course, there are groups who are not religiously aligned who are against abortion and want to outlaw it in most cases. So this is not, just shows that it's not exclusively a religious concern. Okay, and so his argument is secular, then it's not religious. So he argues that abortion is usually wrong, not always wrong, but usually wrong, because it deprives one of one's future. Now, the one in this case would be the fetus, the developing fetus, and at the point of conception, recognizing that it's, first of all, obviously not just a fetus, but a human fetus, and that it has a unique genetic code, and therefore a unique identity. That unique individual is going to have a future if allowed to develop. So in the problem with abortion, according to Marquis, and why it's usually wrong, is that it deprives that individual of that individual's future. Okay, and so what does that mean, to lose your future? What do you actually lose if you lose your future? And it's not, and here's the sort of important point, it's not just the loss of biological life. It's not that. But it's a particular human form of existence, okay? And that means it is the experiences and activities and projects and enjoyments that you value right now. And it is also those experiences and activities and projects and enjoyments that you will come to value as you develop and change. So those are the key points to the future and why it should be understood to be such a grievous loss, you know. And he goes into an explanation for why the language of murder would be relevant here, or killing, and that is what's the wrong-making feature of killing. Well, the wrong-making feature of killing is precisely this. It is the snuffing out of that future, unique experiences, activities, projects, and enjoyments. Okay. So that is the argument. And let's see if I can have another note here about this. Okay, again, he claims that the point of the analysis of the wrongness of killing is to establish which natural property ultimately explains the wrongness of the killing, given that it's wrong. So that natural property then is precisely this idea of one's future. And this is why, for example, that it is not based on, his argument is not based on religious ideas and premises. It's more of a natural law argument. Okay. So he raises some objections to the future like ours argument, and he looks at those, and then he rejects them. So which ones does he look at? Well, what about a fetus does not have the mental capacity to value its own life? So he raises that objection, and he rejects it, explains why he doesn't think that holds. A fetus doesn't have the mental capacity to desire its continued existence. Okay, so they're talking about the psychology, whatever psychology there is with the fetus. Again, he sets this aside, explains why that objection does not hold. Let's see. Then the objection that a fetus is not a full human person, so there's the personhood argument, and thus has no future like ours comparable to adults, children, or infants. So he looks at that consideration as well and rejects it, responds to it. So those are three objections that he talks about. Obviously, the two that have to do with the mental capacity, diminished mental capacity of the fetus, and the other, whether or not the concept of personhood attaches to the fetus. Okay. So he, like Thompson, in at least in this way, he also sort of takes the concept of personhood and where Thompson grants that language of personhood, Marquis shows that you don't need the concept of personhood to show why abortion is immoral. So again, this is why these two articles are particularly interesting angles on this subject. Okay. Then let me see if there was anything else that, that was it, actually. That is it. What I want to do is then talk about your essay question. And by the way, I will have your previous quizzes 8 and 9, I think it was. I'll have those. I'll give you some comments on those, prior to you having to write this one, so that if there's any serious problem, then I'll point it out to you. I mean, on the quick look that I've done, I haven't really seen any serious problems, but I'll give you some suggestions to give you any assistance that I think you need to do well on these questions. So look for that in the next couple days. Okay, so your job on this quiz, your final question is to select either the article by Thompson or Marquis, and then decide which normative theory of the ones that we've studied you think best represents the ethical position the selected author takes toward the morality of abortion. So you can do that with either Thompson or Marquis, and I just want you to select one normative theory. Don't select more than one or talk about more than one. And so our list again is natural law, ethical egoism, consequentialism, Kantian ethics, contractarianism, ethical pluralism, virtue ethics, and feminist ethics. Then your job is to explain and support your answer with specific evidence from the selected article. This means you should explicitly quote at least one relevant passage from the article, cite it, in other words, give the author, page number, and show how and why it supports your answer. Okay, so this is where you have to discuss it, explain how the quote supports the way that you've characterized it as being as representing one of these normative theories over the others. Okay, and lastly, your answer, your paragraph should be a well-developed paragraph of at least 200 words. Okay, now just as a side note here, and I said this before, before your very first example of doing one of these, that excuse me, the thing that you have to do when you select your normative theory that you think best represents the article or the author you've chosen, you need to make sure that you speak about that normative theory accurately. So, in other words, if you talk about ethical egoism, let's say you select ethical egoism, at some point in your paragraph, you should be able, or not able, that's not right. You should be referring to one or more key principles of ethical egoism, if that's the one you selected. So the idea that the supreme value is self-interest. I mean, you should be using the language of self-interest if you've said that, okay, well, I think Marquis' argument is best represented by ethical egoism. At some point in that discussion and the defense of that claim, you'll be talking about at least the primary principle of ethical egoism, self-interest. And the same for each of the other normative theories. There should be some display of on your part that you understand the normative theory, that you understand the key principle or principles involved in them. And you're not just assuming that I believe you. So you need to make sure that you talk about that normative theory in a way that is accurate to what we have read and which you've already been evaluated on. Okay, so I just want to make that point again in case there's in case you see a comment like that on your other quizzes, your previous quizzes, where I felt like, okay, you say it's Kantian, but where's the principle of humanity, or where's the principle of universalizability here? I don't see that at all going on. So just be careful that you're not too loosey-goosey with how you represent the normative theory, that you are paying attention to the details of the theory, in particular the key principle, the key formative principle of that theory. All right. Okay, so what I'll do, let me just pop back real quick to to this. There's your question. So that's what I want you to write about for this upcoming quiz, and you prepare your answer ahead of time, just as with the other ones, so that you can just do a copy paste when you open up the quiz. And I'll put this up, by the way, on Canvas so that you can look at it again. You don't just have to catch it here on the video. Okay, and so now briefly, I want to talk about your final analytical essay. So this is in essentially your final exam, and basically what I'm doing, or I'm asking you to do, is each of these quizzes that we've had on the applied ethics problems, I've given you a short paragraph, or I should say short essay, but really a paragraph, where I've asked you to, associate the one or more of the authors with one of the normative theories, and then, talk about how well that author is represented by that theory, or why you think that theory best explains the author's position. All I'm going to really ask you to do for this final assignment is that, but with more discussion. And I'm going to talk about exactly what's going to go into that essay here in a moment. I'll give you sort of the nitty-gritty details, like how long it should be, that kind of thing. I'll give you that when I publish the formal assignment write-up. But for now, at least, I want to run it by you and give you an introduction to it and hit the key points. And remember that the first thing that you're going to be doing is you're going to be doing your own research here. And by research, I mean doing a Google search. It's not that difficult. But what I want you to do is look around at some of your preferred news sites that have opinion pages, or that write essays on ethical questions. And what I want you to do is use the ethical problems that we've been studying in the class. So just to quickly run through them, the three that we've looked at so far are the moral status of animals. Then we did a unit on poverty and hunger. And then this week we're doing abortion. Next week is affirmative action. The week after that is enhancing human beings. So that's genetic modification. Certainly a hot topic. Then we talk about terrorism and torture. And then the last applied ethics problem is going to be on the environment. Okay, so you can look ahead to some of those topics if those are more interesting to you than the ones that we've looked at so far. And then look for an article, a news article now, not like one of our philosophy articles that we've been reading in this text, The Ethical Life, but look for an opinion piece. And so I gave you examples of those in the showcase. So do have a look at those links for examples of what I'm talking about. So I mentioned the Camille Paglia piece on abortion is a good one. And there's a BBC article on the ethics of charity and whether that's the best way to fight global hunger. And then there is a piece from, I think it's The Guardian, on factory farming of animals. And so you can look at that. Okay, so your job then is to find a news of the day piece on your own about one of these ethical problems that we've studied. And then what you're going to do is, just like you've done with the articles in our text, you're going to identify the author's conceptual framework. And by conceptual framework, I mean their ethical theory that they are assuming or bringing to their discussion of the ethical problem. Okay, so you identify that conceptual framework. Maybe it's maybe it's a contractarianism framework. So that's what you're doing. You're using the moral theories to help you describe and explain the author's ethical approach to the moral problem. Again, this is stuff you've been doing already in the quizzes. Then what you're going to do is you're going to analyze the author's argument. You're going to summarize that author's argument in your own words. So you can do that, in a paragraph, roughly. And then you discuss the author's evidence and reasoning in support of their argument. So you'll point out what evidence they offer. You'll look at the, how their argument works, how the evidence is, what kind of points do they claim that it supports. So you'll discuss those points. All right, so I want you to analyze the author's argument. And that too is something that you're already doing in these quiz questions, where in identifying the normative theory that best applies to the author, one of the author's articles, you are then explaining the author's argument in those terms. So it's the same type of deal that you've already done. And lastly, I'm going to ask you then to evaluate the author's argument. Is it a valid argument? Is it sound? Go back to the introduction of the fundamentals of ethics if you need to remind yourself what those terms mean. What difficulties weaken the argument? And so this is where your previous text, the Fundamentals of Ethics text, can help you, because you can look at what the author sort of stepped us through as the attractions of the different normative theories and the difficulties that they face. So if you remember ones like that, say, contractarianism, one of its advantages was its impartiality, but then how that also could be a disadvantage. So you can look at the author's argument of the online article that you've chosen, and using your knowledge of the conceptual framework of the normative theory, you can anticipate difficulties. You can see whether the author addresses those difficulties or not. Does the author seem to be aware of those difficulties? Okay, so this is where you'll want to use your text, the fundamentals of ethics text, to help you in identifying the strengths and weaknesses part. Okay, so you want to basically grade the author's argument. How well did the author do here? Did they did they make any obvious flaws in their reasoning, and so on. Okay, so that's the assignment, the final analytical essay that'll be due at the end of the semester. Again, I'll give you details about all of that in due course. And with that, we are done, and I can take your questions and answers if I can find where our deal is. Okay, coming back, there we are. Okay. So I've covered everything that I wanted to cover with you. And just to remind you of the showcase is here on the sidebar, where you can look at those articles that I've linked as examples of ones that you can be thinking about for your final analytical essay. And let me just pop over to Q&A and see if anybody has a question in the queue. I don't see any questions. Well, that's all I've got for today. So if you have any questions for me, by all means, drop me a line by email. And good luck on this one. Enjoy the readings. And definitely good stuff to be talking about, family and friends. Very relevant to the ongoing political discussion in the current election, and it'd be interesting to use these readings as a way to inform your own opinions about this topic, and then be able to bounce them off friends and family when you discuss it. Okay, gang. Well, have a great week, and I will catch you next week. And best of luck on the quiz. I'll be seeing you. Take care.